Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome to another video. This is going to be a thread response to Rob Ison, who not so long ago hit 100 subs. He didn't do a contest, but he decided to start a thread, and I thought it was a great idea. Check out Rob's channel if you haven't already. Great guy from the West Midlands, got great taste in music, regularly updates his channel with vinyl finds updates and all sorts of good stuff. His idea, I couldn't resist it. It was music influenced by literature, which is a subject quite close to my heart. Rob showed a few quite interesting things. He also has had at least one response so far from another great channel, which is Rachel the MusicMAM. Check her out. She did a thing, I think her one was mainly looking at Led Zeppelin and the kind of Tolkien-esque references that are in their music, so I won't do that. I've got a nice big pile of stuff here, got some records to show you, got some books to show you. Unfortunately, I don't have all the books that I wanted to show. It's really annoying because there are some books I know for a fact that I do own and I just cannot put my hands on them. It's really annoyed me, but I do have a fair few, so let's crack on. So let's start with the Beatles because you know, most things do start with them. This is Revolver, of course, and on this record there is a song called Tomorrow Never Knows, which is the final song on the record, and it's an amazing psychedelic maelstrom of backward tape loops and all kinds of weird psychedelic stuff, and the lyric for that song was taken by John Lennon from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which was a kind of Tibetan prayer book, or it was a book that was meant to be, you were meant to read out sections of it or have sections read out to you as you were passing on into the next world, you know, as you were dying. I don't have that book. I do have a copy of a kind of modern update of it, which is called the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. In fact, I've got two copies. No, in fact, I've got three copies of that book and I can't find any of them. So hopefully I'll have flashed a picture up on the screen. But yeah, the Tibetan Book of the Dead informed the lyric for that most incredible song, one of the most stupendous sonic achievements of the Beatles, Tomorrow Never Knows. Okay, so now moving on to solo Beatles, we've got George Harrison, his album All Things Must Pass, which of course contains his wondrous pop song My Sweet Lord. And as I'm sure it's well known, George Harrison was deeply influenced by the Bhagavad Gita, or the Bhagavad Gita. He was very into the Krishna movement, and there you can see Krishna there. I don't think George ever particularly based his songs on the stories that come from this book, but the theology was very important to him, so I guess, you know, that counts. I should just say, actually, Rob's video, the idea was literature, as in, you know, books, poetry, that kind of thing. So you know, I'm taking a religious text as falling into that category. Right, so now we have Pink Floyd, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, which is their first album. The title comes from the 7th chapter of Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. And Sid was very influenced by Kenneth Grahame's work, that kind of quirky English, lost in the woods thing, kind of pastoral, slightly mystical children's literature. Also on this record you've got the song Chapter 24, which comes from the I Ching, an ancient Chinese text of divination, really, you know, trying to work out the future. Change returns success, going and coming without error, action brings good fortune, I think was the lyric that he lifted from the I Ching. Sid was a very well-read songwriter. He was very influenced by English poetry and all sorts of, you know, mystical texts, that kind of thing. We'll get to his solo album in one moment, but this is the second Pink Floyd album, A Source Full of Secrets, and the song on this record, which has a literary reference or influence, is Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, and I do need to refer to my notes here. Lyrics borrowed from an ancient Chinese poem called Don't Go Out the Door, and also another poem by an ancient Chinese poet called Li Shangyin, which does contain the line, watch little by little the night turns around, which is one of the lines on Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, which is a very kind of spectral, spacious, mystical sounding psychedelic rock song from the 60s, you know, full of vibes and, you know, kind of incensey, atmospheric, shall we say. And then we've got Syd Barrett's solo album, The Madcap Laughs, which is absolutely chock full of block, full of literary references. At the time, Syd was living in a kind of bedsit in London, and the place was full of old Penguin paperbacks and poetry editions. There's lots of lyrics which reference Shakespearean characters and plays and stuff. The one that really springs to mind from this book, this is A Very Irregular Head, which is a biography of Syd Barrett by Rod Chapman, which is a brilliant book, and it really goes to town tracing all of Syd's literary influences. But he talks in this book about Syd's song Octopus, which draws on an Elizabethan playwright and satirist called Thomas Nash. And there's a poem by him which goes: trip and go, heave and ho, up and down, to and fro, from the town to the grove, two and two let us rove, a maying, a playing, love hath no gainsaying, so merrily trip and go. And anybody who's ever heard Syd Barrett's song Octopus will be able to recognise very clearly the lyrical debt which that song owes to that poem that I just read out. So yeah, Syd Barrett, a very literary songwriter. So let's crack on. So, oh, actually, one more Pink Floyd one. So this is Animals. Now, this was never particularly referenced back to George Orwell and Animal Farm, but there's a definite kind of dystopian feel that runs through this, which brings George Orwell's novel to mind. You know, in this record, Roger Waters, he carves up humanity into three categories of animal. You've got the pigs, you've got the dogs, and you've got the sheep. And that really does bring to mind George Orwell's allegory, Animal Farm, in which animals are made to stand in for the various types of human in a human society. And on the theme of George Orwell, and I can show a book for this one for the first time, we have George Orwell's 1984. David Bowie, song on this record, Diamond Dogs, of course. The song is 1984, which is a fantastic kind of blaxploitation type song. Bowie was incredibly well read. The stuff on his early albums drew on things like Nietzsche, you know, philosophy, but he also drew on lots of very esoteric, mystical texts, a bit like Jimmy Page, you know, Aleister Crowley and all that kind of weird, alternative, magic-y kind of literature from back in the day. But yeah, 1984 and George Orwell, thought that was quite a nice, obvious one to go for. Right, next we've got The Doors, and this is just their band name really, although Jim Morrison was a very literary lyric writer. Obviously, you know, he was kind of known as being a poet, but The Doors name was taken from this book, Aldous Huxley's book The Doors of Perception, which detailed a mescaline trip, I think it was, that he took back in can't quite read the date on there, 1933. He took 0.4 gram of mescaline, sat down and waited to see what would happen. And this book basically goes through and narrates the experience that he had that day. It's an absolutely mind-melting book. And the idea is, you know, with the doors of perception, it's the doorway beyond which everything else exists that we don't normally perceive with our kind of five senses. And you know, once the potentials of psychedelic drugs have been unleashed, then we gain access into that world. And I guess the Doors music, early on, you know, tracks like Break On Through, they were very much tied into that 1960s mentality of trying to escape the prison of the five senses, and that led back very directly to drug literature such as this. We've got Lou Reed, who of course did an album, not this one because I don't own it, but he did do an album based on the writings of Edgar Allan Poe. I think the album was called The Raven, and of course The Raven was a poem by Poe. This is a stupendous compendium of all his work, actually, all his short stories, all his poems. He was a kind of supernatural writer, thriller writer. He wrote lots of very dark, messed up stories and poems. Great stuff. Also, we mustn't forget Lou Reed, his most famous song, arguably, Walk on the Wild Side, was the name of a novel. Nelson Algren, 1958. It was a sort of beat book, really, about a Texan drifter making his way down to New Orleans. That's where Lou got the inspiration for that song. I've got one more Lou Reed reference, which is on the Blue Mask. I'm sorry about the glare. The first song on this record is called My House, which is a song about Lou having a kind of spectral encounter with the ghost of his old writing teacher, Delmore Schwartz. He was a Jewish creative writing teacher, but also a poet and a short story writer. This is an amazing compilation of his stories. He wrote a short story called In Dreams Begin Responsibilities, which is a very kind of trippy, weird, hallucinogenic kind of story. He was amazingly influential, I think, on Lou Reed's writing and his outlook. It's got that very kind of hard-boiled, you know, to the bone kind of literary style where every word is made to count. And I don't think he referenced him that much in his career, but certainly on that track, On My House, Lou references Delmore by name, and the song is basically just a song about him being in his house and having a ghostly visitor of the ghost of Delmore Schwartz. We've got the Easy Rider soundtrack here, which contains Born to Be Wild and The Pusher by Steppenwolf. And again, this was a book, I couldn't lay my hands on it, I really wanted to find it. It's one of my favourite books of all time. The book Steppenwolf by the great mystical writer Hermann Hesse. I couldn't find that one. I did find this one, which is a great book. This is My Belief, which is kind of like, it's sort of semi-autobiographical, I suppose. Hermann Hesse was a very mystical writer, and his stuff was really influential on the 60s counterculture because he dealt in themes of, you know, transcendentalism and spiritualism. And the book Steppenwolf, it's about this guy who's wrestling with his kind of twin nature. Part of him wants to elevate itself into the spiritual realm, and part of him is being kind of dragged down by his baser urges, and the two things run side by side with each other, and it's meant to be a bit of a metaphor or a symbol, you know, for mankind's fallen nature. You know, we have a fallen nature, but we have a spiritual side as well. The book was called Steppenwolf. It made reference to I think it was a wolf from German folklore. Anyway, it's where Steppenwolf got their name from. Right, next one. Marquis Smith from The Fall was a very literary songwriter. He was extremely well read. He just had a vast range of literary influences. The one that sprung to mind was Arthur Machen, who was a very strange kind of Victorian-y sort of supernatural writer. A bit like H.P. Lovecraft, he wrote sort of urban stories about strange supernatural encounters and kind of ancient forces, you know, welling up into our world. Quite kind of haunting, you know, you can see from the cover there, you know, the kind of atmosphere that his stories had. And you can see, you know, on the cover of this Fall album, it has a very similar kind of atmosphere to it, a kind of dark, strange, esoteric, weird influences just kind of lurking under the surface of everyday reality. And I think Marquis Smith drew on Arthur Machen and other writers of that ilk, you know, in order to kind of tap into that world, I suppose. We've got John Cale and his album 1919, which is full of literary references. It references Shakespeare on here and all kinds of things. The track I wanted to just highlight was the song Graham Greene, who was one of the greatest 20th century authors, and I've got a book by him here which is going to pop up again in a minute. This is The Power and the Glory by Graham Greene. He was chiefly famous probably for writing Brighton Rock, which was a very famous film in the 1960s, but that's a great song. It's all about him having tea with Graham Greene. So that's John Cale. Let's do the other Graham Greene one, which is this one, Prefab Sprout. The album Swoon by Prefab Sprout has a song on it called, I can't quite recall the name of the song, so I'm going to have to flash it up. But one of the songs on this record, this is Prefab Sprout's first album, contains a reference to the Whiskey Priest, and apparently that is a reference to Graham Greene's novel, The Power and the Glory, which is set in Mexico in the 1930s, and it's about the suppression of the Catholic faith in Mexico in the 30s, and whiskey priests were priests who were basically kind of on the run. They were Catholic priests who were not allowed to practice, and wine had been outlawed, and they were not allowed to use it, so they used to use whiskey instead, you know, for their ceremonies, and quite a few of them used to get addicted because it was you know, quite powerful stuff, and that's the story of a whiskey priest. The song, in fact, is meant to be a musical version of that story. It sort of tells the story in a very oblique way, because Paddy Muckledoon kind of had that way of splintering narrative elements and making them, you know, a bit more kind of hard to grasp. And I think it came quite easily to him to kind of wrap his songs up in literary references. This one, Steely Dan, and the song Home at Last. On the surface, it was meant to be a song just about the fact that they'd been transplanted from their native New York and had to go to California, you know, in order to make this album, and they were sort of pining for home. But also, it's meant to have another level of meaning, and it's meant to refer back to the Odyssey by Homer. There's a lyric in the song about the danger of the rocks being passed, and he says, "I think I might have found my home at last." And of course, the Odyssey is about Odysseus travelling back from the Trojan War, trying to get back to his homeland and encountering all kinds of awful dangers, including horrific dangers on the rocks, you know, the Hydra, and just, you know, various awful creatures rearing up trying to destroy him. So Steely Dan sort of tried to give their song a bit of a literary backdrop. So it was a song about their own homesickness, but they sort of dressed it up with a bit of Homeric imagery, I suppose. Just a bit of a silly one. This is Queen, and we have, of course, End of Side 1, The Invisible Man, H.G. Wells. Fantastic book. Just two to finish. Bob Dylan was vastly influenced in his career by Arthur Rimbaud, who was a French poet who was very into making poetry that kind of mixed up all the senses and just was, you know, fairly hallucinogenic. Dylan drew on him a lot on the Blonde on Blonde album. You know, he was very into French poetry, Verlaine, Rimbaud, etc. So that sprung to mind. So I should have showed Dylan. I picked that record because Time Out of Mind actually is a Shakespeare reference. I think it comes from Act 1 of Romeo and Juliet. Dylan. Right, last one. Now this one's a bit strange. This one, it's not literary necessarily, but it is drama. Squeeze Chris Difford was massively influenced by something called the Wednesday Play, which was a series of TV plays which ran in the 60s. And they were overseen by very well-respected writers of their day. People like Ken Loach, I think, directed a couple of them, and they were kind of gritty working-class plays. One of the more famous ones was based on a short story, and it was called Up the Junction, and it was a play about a couple of girls living near Clapham Junction, and, you know, working in the factory and so on. And Christopher drew on that in order to create his fantastic song Up the Junction, which is a good example of kind of working class English social conscience lyricism, really. And he did it again a couple of times. You know, on the Argy Bargy album, there are songs on that record which harken back to certain Wednesday plays and, you know, certain theatrical plays as well. The song Vicky Verky has a storyline in which a young girl gets pregnant, and, you know, she gets involved with a sailor, and that comes straight from A Taste of Honey by Sheila Delaney, which was a British play from the 1950s. So yeah, he was quite good at weaving these literary references fairly effortlessly into his songs. So anyway, that's it. Got a huge pile of books and records to tidy up here now, so I better leave it there. Hope you enjoyed it. Check out Rob's channel, and I'll see you all soon. Bye bye.